Okay, welcome to your 7th lecture of the series of 12 lectures. Today, you've got me, and what I'm going to do is do a review of the lectures so far, and I'm going to do them in small little chunks. So if you have some time to reflect, and if you do have a laptop in front of you, you should obviously be open either the Moodle page or the blog page of Gamsway, or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, because I'm going to ask you to do some things during the little breaks within those lectures. So what I'm going to do first of all is to tell you about today. Today's going to be a series of questions I'm going to ask you that are actually fundamental to everything you do at university. If you don't think about these questions, you will find that you will come, in the end, not to have learned as much as you should have done or could have done during your 3 years at the University of Greenwich. So it's vitally important that you think about some of these questions that I'm going to ask. Again, I'm not asking you to answer them. In fact, I'm asking you to think about how I'm going to answer them. So, the lecture today is called What Have I Learnt So Far? And I'm going to go through the lectures one by one and just have a little bit of a review about each of those lectures. And I'm going to have a little bit of time to actually think about some of the questions I'm going to ask. So the questions that I'll ask will be: going right back to the beginning, how do you learn? So the question you might want to ask yourself is, how best do I learn? Now, if you've got an answer to that, good, well done. That's very successful. You've become a very successful student. I suspect none of you have thought for a while exactly about that fairly fundamental question at university, is how do I best learn? So that's one of the questions. Second question is slightly easier in many ways, but it's actually linked to the first question. It is, what have I learned so far? So we were going through that. So that's one of the questions you'll have to think about when we go through the lectures. But at the same time, it is, what have I learnt so far? I've learnt so far X. How have I learnt that? Okay, so think about how you learnt that piece of information, or that piece of knowledge, or that idea. And the last question, which is the question we will do right at the end, is a slightly more philosophical question. And it's a question I want you to think about during this next 40 minutes or so. And the question is, what is a record? Okay, on the surface, it may seem like a very, very simple question, but actually when you break it down, it's quite complicated. And we'll talk about that philosophically, as well as educationally, as well as how you would go about answering that question. So, I'm just going to quickly go through my first lecture. I think most of you were here. My first lecture was what? Someone shout something out. What was it about?
Well, your one.
Yeah, my first thing. When we were first in it, which was probably most of your second time in this lecture, what was it about?
Introduction.
Yeah, what was it about?
We were just talking about what we're going to be doing for this term, and then like the essay of the magazine and blog, and what's going to happen over the next week.
So it was an introduction to the overall project. I've got eyes all over the place. Yeah. I don't want to say remember what Gordon said at one point during his lecture, because there were some things going on. Okay? So it was an introduction. Now, some of you came up to me afterwards and said, how do I write about that? What do I write about that piece of work that I was giving out? I would suggest what you do is you describe the lecture, say, in a couple of sentences, Mark introduced the brief, and the brief was to do X. Write those in your own words. Sum up the brief very briefly to say this is what it is. Because what do you think an introduction to your magazine, blog, film should do? Because it's the opening piece of writing that's in your magazine. What do you think it should do? Any guesses about what an introduction should do? Draw the reader in. Yeah, so say, come on, how are you going to do that? How would you draw the reader into this fantastic magazine, that blog, film that you've created? How would you do it? No idea whatsoever. Okay. Introductions. The first thing in an introduction is to have an attention grabber. Something that wakes people up. Yeah? So an introduction should say somehow, perhaps, not only introduce the lecture, but you go before that, introduce the magazine itself. This is a fantastic magazine. It's brilliant. It's done by you. You're the editor. You know, it's going to be spectacular. So you need to tell the reader what this magazine is about. So you can say it's about 12 lectures that happen at French University with some famous and less famous people giving lectures about certain things. But you need to have an intention for it. So in that introduction, you tell me what is going to happen, when is it going to happen, possibly why it's going to happen, and who did it. So your introduction is a description of what's going to happen next. So you may describe the brief, you may then describe the lecture. When is the introduction written, do you think? What? Editorial. Editorial. Okay, no, but when is the introduction written? Have a guess. Think about what I've just said. It's a description of what's happened. So when do I write my introduction? Okay. There's only one person who'd be awake so far. You write the introduction right at the end. In many ways, it's your last piece of writing you do, because you can't introduce something until it's been done. So some of you started your introduction, but in one way, that's the last thing you do. Because you've written all the other articles, you've got all the images, you've made your magazine. So it is at the end. I also introduce you to writing. And if you go to that bit on Gamswen, I think it's also on Moodle, you will also find that bit, which I introduced to you. Do you remember that? That acronym called DANCE, which means every single article that you write should be in this form. It doesn't necessarily have to go in this order, but it should have a description of what happened. Now, often, at this stage of your writing career, that's all it is a description of what happened. You won't get very many marks for that. Yeah? Henry, what did I just say?
You won't get many marks for that.
For what?
Bad introduction.
For what?
A bad introduction.
What?
Bad introduction.
A bad introduction. No. I said you won't get very many marks if you just describe what happened. Okay? An 11-year-old can describe what happened. So what you need to do is analyse it. And you may analyse it in terms of bringing other people in to help you talk about it, i.e. other writers, other people who've written about it. You may also voice your own opinion about it based on some sort of knowledge. Yeah? You want to have a narrative. So this story that you're writing isn't just, and then he did this, and then he said that, and then he said this, and then he went on to say that. You know, by the time the reader's got to the fourth sentence in your writing, they've fallen asleep. So it needs to have a story. So some of you might like to write in a manner of a thriller, say. Did anybody here read thrillers? So it might be a film noir-y type thriller. Suddenly appeared the Dean in all his glory.
And said things no one understood.
And he started to say things that made my mind expand to where I do not know. I'm asking you to also do something that's fairly creative. You're all creative people. Yeah? So create a narrative, create a story. Yeah? You must contextualise the subject matter. Again, you're at university, so we're expecting you to be able to say, okay, Nick Clear talks about animation, space and architecture. What is the context for those things? Yeah? Historically, politically, psychologically, socially, personally perhaps. How did it affect you again? And then, at the end of this piece of writing, you always have an evaluation, a conclusion. And the evaluation should be about, well, okay, we had a lecture. What was that all about? What actually happened? What did I, in fact, learn from that? Okay, my introduction, you may say, all I learned was that I write 12 articles, minimum of 300 words per article. One was going to be 1,000 words, and it will be basically on what happened during the lectures. Yeah, that may be what I learned from it, but what you might have also learned is that you learned how to do some writing. Okay, any questions about the introduction? Okay, can stop the video now.